Hi, this is Dr. Mayberry. This is our lecture for out-of-class time discussing inheritance. So this is designed to supplement a lot of what we've been talking about in lecture. It's very important information for you to understand before we move into more complicated areas of genetic inheritance. So we've been spending a lot of time talking about traits that are controlled by single genes. And we've been talking about how some alleles for those traits are dominant and they're always expressed if they're present, and some are recessive and they're only expressed if they're present in 2 copies. And sometimes you end up with 2 different alleles and they both get expressed, and that's codominance. And it's all, relatively straightforward. So the first thing that I have to say to complicate this a little bit, I mentioned briefly in class, but it's just the fact that just because any given individual only has 2 alleles for a trait doesn't mean that there are only 2 alleles in a population. So for many of these traits that are controlled by one gene, the population itself has many possible alleles. So if we're talking about plants, then we can talk about flower color and say there's an allele for purple, there's an allele for red, for pink, for white, whatever color you can think of, right? In the population. In an individual, there are only 2. One came from mom and one came from dad. So whether those are dominant or recessive or codominant or whatever happens to be the case, each individual that we've been talking about has 2, and that is always the case in an organism that we're within this spectrum. But the population may have any given number of possible alleles for that trait. So that's single gene traits that are controlled by one gene. We haven't yet talked about traits that are controlled by more than one gene. I've mentioned briefly that inheritance is much more complicated in people. It's because most, or at least many, of our traits are polygenic. So many genes control them. So height, skin color, hair color, eye color, there are, nose shape, any number of these are controlled by multiple genes. And all of those genes have multiple alleles. So it's a lot more complicated, but it's also a lot more common. One of the ways that you can tell that a trait is controlled by multiple genes is when you look at a population. So you look at the population and you don't see 2 variants, right? You don't see discrete variants. So even if we're talking about flower color and we have purple flowers and pink flowers and red flowers and white flowers, those are all discrete, right? It's either purple or it's pink or it's white or it's red. With skin tone, with eye tone color, we don't see that. We actually have a sort of bell curve in the human population. That bell curve, which is illustrated in this image over here, the skin pigmentation, the bell curve shows us on a population level that this is a trait that's probably controlled by many genes. So when you see a bell curve, which is what you see, especially for skin color and height in human populations, that bell curve should sort of ring a bell in your head, no pun intended, that this is a trait that's controlled by a bunch of genes, and that's why we see this really gradual variation in the human population. So that's our first thing that's going to sort of complicate what we've been talking about, but it's really important just to realize that that is the case. Okay, so what we need to focus on now is how these alleles came about. So you need to know that the source of all variation of every different allele out there is mutation. So it's due to some mutation that happened, sometimes we know how long ago and sometimes we have no idea, but some time ago, that a new allele popped up in a population. Now, we will be talking in class about, or we have already talked, about how some mutations cause good changes and some cause bad. So when a mutation occurs and an allele is altered, and maybe it becomes a new allele, If that change is somehow advantageous to the individuals that have it, then it's probably going to increase their chances of survival. And that will increase their chances of reproduction. So then in the next generation, we might see more offspring that have that allele. If it's advantageous, we see that allele popping up more and more often just because the individuals with it are producing more babies. So we see more and more of that allele. That is evolution, right? We're changing the amount that allele shows up in the population. So we'll talk about this in a lot more detail in a little bit in class, but you need to know that new alleles come about because of a mutation in the genetic code, in the DNA, that changes the RNA and then changes the protein. And if that is somehow advantageous, then you're going to see a spike in the amount that allele shows up in a population. If it's not advantageous, if it's just a no big deal thing, it might stick around in a population, but it might take longer for it to become more common. And if it's disadvantageous, if it's bad, then sometimes we'll see the individuals that have it die. Other times it will take a very long time to come about in a population. And we'll talk about specific examples of how that happens in humans throughout the course of the class. So this will come up again and again and again. You need to know that new alleles can pop up at any time because mutations happen all of the time. We only see them pass to the next generation, and I've said this multiple times, but we only see mutations pass on to the next generation if they've happened in eggs and sperm, in gametes, right, in sex cells that create offspring. So that's very important to remember. When we're looking at populations and we're trying to see allele frequency changing, so the amount that an allele shows up in a population, if we're trying to see if that's changing or if it's staying the same, we actually have an equation that helps us with that. It's called the Hardy-Weinberg equation, and it's down here in this blue box on this slide. So P and Q are the frequencies of two different alleles in a population, and we can actually look at those frequency numbers and see if they change between generations. And it's changing in the amount that an allele shows up in one generation or the next that is evolution. So we can look at a population and figure out if evolution is taking place. And if it is, we can try to look deeper and see, well, maybe this new allele is actually advantageous. Maybe people with that allele or organisms with that allele are producing more offspring, and that's why we're seeing this change. So it's very important in humans and in really all other organisms for us to see if evolution is happening, how is it happening, where is it happening within the genetic code. So this is a really valuable equation for us, and we'll talk more about this in class as well. Meiosis, we have talked about a couple of times. So meiosis, of course, is that cellular replication in gametes, in sex cells. So it's really creation of egg and sperm. So we're talking about alleles, we're talking about inheritance. It all comes back to meiosis, because this is where you are producing offspring with these eggs and sperm. So let's say that there's a woman, or many women, all women and all men have half of their DNA from their mom and half of their DNA from their dad. So we're going to look at this woman, and her body is producing eggs. And in every egg that meiosis has created, that egg has one copy of her DNA, right? She has two copies of everything. One copy came from her mom and one copy came from her dad. But every one of her eggs, because meiosis is creating an egg that has half of the necessary DNA for a viable offspring, because that egg eventually needs to be fertilized by a sperm that has the other half, So any one of her eggs has half of her DNA. What it doesn't have is a total copy from her mom or a total copy from her dad. It has a mix. It has a shuffled up combination of DNA that's a little bit from her mom and a little bit from her dad. So it's new. It's this new combination of alleles that has never existed before. That is so important to survival of a species, to variation within a species. And if you think back to Darwin and his postulates, he said that we have to have variation in a species for evolution to occur. For natural selection to favor a variant, everybody can't be the same. So meiosis is what allows us to not all be the same. There aren't just 4 variants in people. Everyone is a little bit different from everyone else. And that's because of meiosis. And the thing that allows for the shuffling to occur is crossing over and recombination. So I've mentioned this a couple of times. Here's another image that shows you recombination. When those chromosomes line up, the homologous chromosomes line up and their legs sort of flop over each other and pieces of the DNA recombine, that gives you that mix of this woman's mom and dad in these chromosomes. And when those get separated into eggs, it's this shuffled up mix of her DNA. So this is just, I can't emphasize enough how critical this is for variation in the species. So mutation is the source of all of this variation. It's the thing that creates new alleles for genes. But this recombination during meiosis allows those different alleles to be shuffled in a variety of ways to produce more variants in offspring. So these concepts in this short little lecture are so important for understanding inheritance, for understanding evolution, that they are incredibly critical for you to keep moving on in this course and keep understanding everything that we're talking about. So be sure that you understand how all of this works, and if you don't, please ask me questions in class or email me with any questions.